Live. All right, we are live. You are listening to Transparency and Merit with Joe and Brian. Do you remember what it's like to have nothing?
Do I remember?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember absolutely what it is like to have nothing. I certainly felt the deepest loss of nothing when I lost, like first my mother and then my father. That kind of, I guess, security of forever. And financially, I have been down on my luck. And sometimes, even now, that feeling, even though I'm somewhat comfortable, I could lose it all in a second, and that's one of the reasons why people are passionate about politics. Whether you have a business or you are a person on a fixed income living off the government, there's always that worry that you could all of a sudden end up losing everything.
When I think of the example of going from nothing to something, it is inevitable that I start thinking about the hippies. the hippies that started off very idealistic and very left, liberal leaning, who had nothing and suddenly found themselves in suits, going to work, paying a mortgage, and becoming steadfast Republicans.
I don't know how many became steadfast Republicans, but I'm sure
A lot. I
when
think the ones that mattered did.
you remember the show Family Ties?
I sure do. With Alex B. Keaton.
Yes. So, and I'm just curious on this.
Alex P. Keaton.
Yes. How many of the hippies turned into corporate conservatives and stuff like that? I don't know how many.
Well,
But
what made that show good is he had the liberal minded parents,
yes,
and out of nowhere he's this wearing a tie, and I'm talking Michael J. Fox's role was very Republican.
that's true. I gotta think that those that were in, I don't think the counterculture lasted that long, or like once they got a dose of hard living and sanitary conditions, I think they decided to.
Once
Uh,
they got a taste of the good life.
they'd always had a taste of the. Like, I don't want to say they've always had the taste of the good life, because you know before I make any kind of remark on that, I'd like to know the statistics, because you know America has been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but there's a certain myth about the 50s of white picket fence and things like that. When in reality, we have Wayne Whiteside here. He grew up, I think, in the kind of in the 50s, 60s, and he grew up very poor. And there were a lot of Americans that were very poor in the 1950s and 60s, and I think the nostalgia of the 50s is much more than the reality of the 1950s. Uh, we had recessions, the kind. We had people doing backbreaking farm like labor.
I can't believe you're even denying that this is what happened. This is you can go in. There's plenty of research that's been done that demonstrates this. The 80s never could have happened if it wasn't for the defection of those sweet liberal-minded people who became Republicans and created the whole bond market and savings and loans. There's just no there's so many ties and connections that demonstrate that. We can get into that, but yeah, that's certainly
Coincidence.
that's been done. That's been done.
And
We
we
just
do
got
have
to find
our chat board here. But I want to mention that how large and how big was the hippie movement really? Um, uh, I remember.
do you know why we don't have more Vietnams?
Well, it was because it became unpopular, and the hippies were.
Right. It's because people fought back against it, and so they didn't want to risk that. So that's why we don't see these. We had the Gulf Wars, but that was pretty much the last of its kind, I think. Primarily because they didn't want the, they didn't want an unpopular war where everybody just was too awake. This is how I see it, at least. But yeah,
I'm not really. I'm not really. I'm not. There was a counterculture, and they were the loudest ones in the room, and but there were also people that were anti-war that were not hippies. Um, and one of our listeners right now, Wayne, he was into the music but not being a hippie. So hippies were part of the counterculture, and the anti-war movement wasn't necessarily the hippie movement. And the hippie movement came and it went. And I think one of the things that really killed the hippie movement was Charles Manson. But I remember in Haight Ashbury, even in '68 and stuff, they were saying the hippie movement is dead. And the hippie movement kind of came and went. And now on the left, we have, Antifa and BLM, and we still have a hip hop movement. Disco died out, but hip hop and rap have continued along. Um, and the kind of experimental things. It is done, but experimental things are not done the way they used to be. And I guess right now the counterculture is, some would say, is kind of conservative because you're banned everywhere if you have a conservative mindset. That is now the new counterculture. I could be wrong on that, but that is my small perspective on that. And my thing is that there is an empowerment, I think, in having nothing and just living on your own, and just I've heard of people who just like they live on the street, or they camp out, and they have no worries or anything like that, and they're true survivalists, and they seem to be rather happy. But I could be wrong on that. And Wayne said the '80s weren't all fun and games. The '80s were, for me at least, when I went to LA and stuff, it was kind of a magical time. It was part of my childhood, so there was a little bit of magic there in the '80s. I don't know, Joe, if you feel the same way.
The 80s was the biggest party on earth, and it was because there was more money, there was more coke, there was more of a lot of things. And the 80s were vibrant. There was big colors. They, the movies were very different. You went from we had the introduction of the blockbuster. We had just so many things. But of course, right, the 80s weren't all fun and games. We had a lot of there were a lot of shifts, a lot of changes in the money and banking. So even though people did have more money and there was more of that sort of thing going on, there were also some more heavy-handed uh, grips on control that were happening that people just were probably partying through. I think that's how we fell into some of these. It was the first time we had these major bank scandals. There was, I always liked the old Z Best story, but it was one of many. It was very much a sign of the times. People, basically, if you don't know the Z Best story, it was a building maintenance company that some dude from the city where I grew up in, San Fernando Valley, uh, started going to banks and getting huge loans based on fraudulent um, work orders that he was creating, and basically built an empire very quickly. And as quickly as Z-Best became well known, it was uncovered what it was exactly up to, and there was a huge fall. And but it was the reason why I like that story is because it was a small example of a huge problem that was going on throughout the country. So that was part of the darker aspect of the '80s. Um, I don't know what. I
Well,
don't know.
America,
Can you think of some of the other
I'll tell you something. America. I mean, if you talk about cinema and the movies, America had become much more conservative. Um, the late 1960s and late 1970s, and I don't think you've seen a time like that. I think within the arts, I mean, with both music and in cinema, you saw a kind of stark reality that you do see in films today, but they were not as mainstream as they were. The '90s kind of touched on it, but really and truly, some of the most starkly real films were really made in the late 1960s and 1970s. And the '80s went back to kind of a mythological sort of fantasy kind of thing. I remember,
Oh, just complete non sequitur movies too, like just beyond slapstick. Like Airplane may have been kind of like a forerunner, but then there was these movies that were just so outlandish and over the top. Every like so not every, but so many of those movies too portrayed just heavy, just weird behavior, um, and high behavior. And it's pretty interesting to go. It's interesting to go back and look at those films.
you know, I can remember. I mean, I was making a comment on because Southern Comfort is the movie. Southern Comfort is free on YouTube, and that film came out in 80, or I think it was 81. And I commented that like I was one of the only, me and my old man and my brother were like one of the only ones in the movie theater, and we kind of there was kind of a thing like why Siskel and Ebert both liked it. It got a lot of good reviews, and why it didn't make more money. And I kind of mentioned that these kind of Vietnam deliverance sort of films came really out of style by the time Southern Comfort came out. And they were really into more fantasy or more, sexual orientated teen romps than they were into gritty dramas like the movie Southern Comfort. And yeah, people wanted to be escapism, and they wanted to be happy again. The '70s was a really down, gritty time, and people said, you know what? I want something like E.T., and I don't want Taxi Driver. I want E.T. I want Star Wars. I just want things that are going to make me happy when I go to the big screen.
A movie that holds up, I'm told, and should be watched again is Trading Places. I really want to check that out again and maybe do a movie night on the Discord and get everyone in to watch that one because it's one you can kind of talk over and watch.
Well, there are plenty of films that you can just, like, yeah, you can get over and you can talk over and you can just uh, show and stuff like that. Trading Places was, but it was an '80s film, and it it still was, it had a happy ending to it, and it was uplifting. The bad guys lost, even though it was an anti capitalist film, and it was I don't know if it was considered an anti capitalist film, but it was basically it said something about it's not it's a person's circumstances that makes their life, not their uh, not the way they are, or their genetics or whatever. I don't know if I I don't know if I agreed that poverty creates crime, because the 1930s had far more poverty and there was far less crime. And even like I said, the 50s and 60s had quite a bit of poverty, and the crime really skyrocketed in the late 1960s and in the 70s. And uh, the 90s with the crime bill and stuff, I think we saw a little bit of deviation, but the
Well,
morale.
you also saw a heavy change in the programming and more violence and sex in television shows like Hill Street Blues and movies. There's too many to name, but there was definitely a ramping up of violence. There's also the incoming video game revolution. So there were a lot of triggers and a lot of programming that went into that. Also, a huge, like, it started in the '70s. It started before that, but it really, the horror film industry also was insane and blew up. And don't forget, of course, Deep Throat introduced us to a tie-in between the sexual porn revolution and tie into politics.
Well, I
So
mean but and that was in the 70s, by the
that
way.
was in the 70s, but the 80s really blew up. That was another huge factor in the 80s as
Well,
well.
the 80s, the home video,
VHS.
VHS home video took off, and you know, pornography films were, that's when it really became a multi-billion-dollar industry with home videos, and home videos like porno home videos were like, it was like $80
Okay,
for.
I see. This is where I disagree. You look too deep into these films. 80s movies were made to make money, and I couldn't disagree with that. I couldn't disagree more. And it's because these movies don't just get released. There's absolutely a method to the madness. There's story arcs, there's actor arcs and actress arcs and director arcs, career arcs I'm talking about. So movies are very regimented on how they're released. They could be queued up for years before they end up getting shown, and it's all done for purpose and programming, and to show, especially like the convergence when you leave one decade to the next. You see a whole new style of film suddenly. That doesn't just happen overnight. It does not because a bunch of writers and directors just like, oh, this is a great idea. This is a money making move right here. I think there's a much deeper role. The whole of Hollywood, especially. Um, I think there's a much larger role than just the money.
I was taking a little bit of a break there, but a film has to make about three times its money back to break even, and yeah,
How's Drugstore Cowboy hold up? Is that
that in the late, that was, I think that was in 1989, and films, there was the early 80s, and then the mid 80s they came out with Platoon, and that started with kind of a more gritty. They started to make more gritty films. I think Drugstore Cowboys was in the 90s,
well, 89, but yeah, into the 90s. So.
and in the late 80s, and in near the late 80s, you had films like Colors.
And that, yeah, by the way, Drugstore Cowboy is an interesting movie because of that fact. It it toned down. It definitely was a message of what was to come in the 90s, which was a much darker, drug fueled place. It brought on grunge, after all, and movies weren't as big and vibrant. I don't think Hollywood was going to keep that momentum for whatever reason, but it's certainly part of the program, part of the programming, and that is a great example of a transitional film that really took us out of the lighter 80s and took us into a darker 90s.
Well, I think Platoon, and then they had the film Colors, which
Mhm.
came out in '87, where you started to have a more like, because I remember they had Break In, and the uh, the streets were a lot more about, you know uh, street dancing and performance art, and then all of a sudden it became about gangs and drugs, and a lot of that stuff, and anti-authoritarianism and police brutality, and a lot of the anti-police stuff is still with us. It is still rather popular, and the stuff that came out of the gang culture is with us. I mean, is with us today, and it hasn't left us. I mean, the good feelings of the '80s. The breaking. Uh, I mean, some of the fantasy films are with us, but there's not a lot of it's the happy stuff. Not as much. The Back to the Futures and it's a lot of it's Marvel movies, or they'll do films that about gang life that they glorify, and I mean I'll get into that later. How they tend to glorify and make a lot of it's making that thing to be an ego boost to be part of that, and to uh, you know kind of a poetic thing, and I think that's kind of a bad thing. I'm not sure I agree with a lot of these um, so-called ghetto films, and they made a lot of them. And after Boys in the Hood, there were quite a few of them made, and I'm not sure. You know, that was also a lot of propaganda. There's propaganda on one end with the John Wayne. She wore a yellow ribbon, and then there's another side of propaganda like Boys in the Hood, uh, about inner city living, which there's always a license with reality and truth, and that's something I would kind of get into later about propaganda and cinema, and how people uh, put their own views and stamps on things that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah, I mean, Wayne says that is funny. He liked movies about drugs when he was into drugs, and I mean, people have been looking for the best movies to smoke and watch too, and um, I think most movies are just complete escapism. So it
Yeah,
sets the stage for smoking one. All right, so where are we at here, Wayne? No worries. We um we are taking calls if you are interested. If not,
yeah,
no
that's
big
fine as
deal.
well. We can always, and
Yeah, no big deal.
we can always clear this broadcast. If we have nothing really left to add, to me, I think at times you should strive to be as minimalist as you can. I had an aunt who would literally, she was a penny pincher. She was very frugal. She would count, like, every penny she had, and she ended up being a millionaire. And I think there's something to be said for frugality and being a minimalist. There's a lot of people who want to, they look at the high life and they want to live like, an Elon Musk or a Donald Trump, or a Jeff
Kanye.
Bezos, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not always possible. And I don't know if that really is something that will make you happy, uh, particularly if you're not making that kind of money and you strive to buy things with that. And uh, things, I think people make you more happy than things. And the thing that um, the thing that I always thought that wealth would buy me would be female attention, and that I think is also fleeting after a while. Once I lost my mom, I realized that uh, female attention is not the most precious thing. There is other attention besides that, and there's better love than the love of a woman you find attractive, or super. Particularly as I get older, And Wayne has said he is too high to call in. So what can you do when you're high? You know?
That is great. All right. Well, do we have anything to add to this?
You know what? I don't know if we have.
His aunt's now deceased.
Yeah,
Sorry,
my
Wayne.
aunt is deceased. If you want her, if you want to talk to her, you're going to have to meet her in the same place, I guess. Perhaps you'll see her, and
Yes,
you can
in the
talk.
afterlife.
If the afterlife, if they're saving money in the afterlife, what kind of currency is needed? Thomas Sowell one time said, "We our species evolved into poverty, and that's where we are. That's where we go when we die. We have nothing. We we are born into poverty, which means we have nothing except what our parents give us. You could be born without parents, which means you're really in poverty and are raised by the state. And when you die in poverty as well. So sometimes I think the happiest you can be is probably when you have nothing and you don't need anything.
Maybe there's Bitcoin in the afterlife.
You know what? I mean, you know what? And there's Bitcoin. You can always look that up. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. And if you don't like our show, tell me why.
Toodles. Let's play a little more of this. Go to the website, transparencyandmerit.com. Check out the store while you're there. It's pretty good.